Hello everyone, and welcome to our third Q&A episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and I hope everyone here had a very happy holidays. This will be our last episode of 2022, and since I'm currently on vacation, I thought it would be a good idea to close off the year with another Q&A episode. We've previously released episodes like this back at the end of 2018 and 2020, and I think it's about time to do it again, so without any further ado, let's get started. So our first question was basically asked by 4 separate listeners, and they're all pretty much variations on the same question, so I thought I would answer them all at once. This particular question was asked by John, Tom, Ben, and Mike, and it's pretty much how much time is spent researching, writing, recording, and editing together an episode, and how much work goes into making this podcast. Well, to be quite honest, even though I get asked this question a lot, I really don't have a concrete answer because I don't actually keep track of the exact number of hours I take in order to put together an episode. And I think the big problem with giving a conclusive answer is because it pretty much varies because each case sometimes has a different amount of work. There are some cases like the Danny Casolaro episode or the Alcatraz episode or the Boys on the Tracks episode where I have so much more material to go through that it could take weeks. But if I'm doing a case in which there's less information and the episode is going to be shorter, it takes far less time. And consequently, if it's a case from unsolved mysteries that I'm very familiar with and know like the back of my hand, I can put together an episode relatively quickly. But if it's a case I've never heard of before and doing it on the podcast is my first dive into it, then it's probably going to take a lot longer to craft the whole episode from scratch. But my standard process is gathering all the material for an episode, putting it together in a script, and then proofreading it to try to make it perfect before I record the episode, and sometimes doing a polished draft of my script takes a lot longer than researching and writing the script to begin with. And I usually record the rough cut of the episodes on weekends, and then I send them to my editor, McGill Foote, and he spends the week editing it and putting Vince Nitro's music to it, and then usually on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, he sends me the audio of it. I listen to it to make sure there are no flubs left in, and if the episode is good, then we drop it on Patreon for releases on Tuesday morning, and then drop the episode for release to the general public on Wednesday morning. It's a pretty fine, well-oiled machine. We've been doing it for nearly 7 straight years, and it seems to work, so I see no reason to change it anytime in the future. So our next question is variations of the same question asked by 2 different listeners, Aaron and Curtis, so I'm going to answer it here. And it's, if you could go back in time to gather clues of one case that went cold, what it would be. Think of yourself as Al Calavici from Quantum Leap. You can see, hear, and record what's going on, but not interact or change it. And one caveat that Curtis threw in is that I couldn't select the Tommy Ziegler case because that would normally be my my number one pick because I've always wanted to see how the events unfolded that night from beginning to end and see if they really took place like the prosecution said at Tommy Ziegler's trial. So if I can't choose Tommy Ziegler, I think my answer to this question would be a baffling missing persons case that pretty much doesn't have any clues, and that's the disappearance of the Springfield Three, the 3 women who vanished from their home in the middle of the night back in 1992. And what's infamous about that case is that the only real clue we have to work with was the broken globe for the porch light, and that's pretty much it, and we don't even know if this broken globe has any relevance to their disappearance. What I find fascinating about this case is that 2 of the victims, Cheryl Levitt and her daughter Susie Streeter, they actually owned a dog that was found at the house when the women were discovered to be missing and was thrown into the bathroom probably by the perpetrator, and you get the sense that this dog probably witnessed the whole thing and could be the clue to the case, but unfortunately dogs cannot talk, so we're unable to rely on its eyewitness testimony to blow this case wide open. But if I had the ability to go back in time and witness these events, or at least gather a few additional clues, I would definitely want to use them in order to solve this case, because I consider it to be one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries of the modern era, and I would definitely like to find the necessary clues in order to shed some light on what happened, because I would really like to see this one get solved someday. So our next question are variations of the same question sent in by Kristen and Jennifer, and it's, is there a victim that you feel an especially strong connection to? I guess I'm asking if you've ever covered a case and learned about a victim and thought, in another life, I could see myself as having been good friends with this person. The follow-up to that would be, if so, did it fuel your desire to talk about the case and help solve the mystery? Well, I think my answer to this would be the unexplained 1996 death of Patrick Sean Kelly, which was covered on Unsolved Mysteries and also on episode number 57 of The Trail Went Cold, and I think it's a hugely underrated case that doesn't get a lot of discussion today, but I think it's a pretty perplexing mystery. I think one reason that I identify with Patrick is that he's Canadian just like myself, and at the time of his death he was attending the University of Southern California, where he was majoring in film and screenwriting, and I'm a big film buff myself. I'm really into screenwriting. That's what I took in university, and I know that at the time he died, Patrick had just completed his semester where he completed an entire feature-length screenplay, which is exactly what I did when I was in school, so I felt that if we had been attending at the same time, then we probably would have become good friends. If you're not familiar with the story, Patrick, after he completed his semester, decided to go on a weekend trip to Tijuana, but was killed after being hit by a car. But there are just so many strange things about this case that his mother believed that something bad may have happened to him, and that he was the victim of foul play. And another thing frustrating about this case is because Patrick was a Canadian citizen who was attending school in the United States and died in Mexico, there's a lot of red tape trying to get a proper investigation into his death, because technically he died on Mexican soil, so it's the jurisdiction of their law enforcement. But because Mexican police are not known for investigating cases too well, his mother has never been able to find conclusive answers about his death. But yes, even though I'm someone who probably never would have taken a trip to Mexico to go drinking when I was Patrick's age, because I was way too shy back then, I could see myself becoming friends with him because it seemed like we led very similar lives. So our next question is asked by Lori, and it's a pretty simple one, and it's, how old are you? Well, believe it or not, I'm currently 44 years old, which comes as a complete shock to many people because when they see me or meet me or watch video of me, they say that I do not look 44 years old at all, and I take that as a huge compliment. But I definitely drop in a lot of hints over the course of the podcast because I talk a lot about how I watched Unsolved Mysteries growing up and watched certain segments and episodes when they originally aired, which meant that I must have been a kid during the late 80s and early 1990s. And I've also mentioned that my birthday also happens to be the same day that Frederick Valentich, the Australian pilot, went missing, and there's been speculation that he was abducted by a UFO. So I always say, because that's the most famous event that took place on the day I was born, I guess I was predestined to grow up and have an interest in unsolved mysteries. So our next question asked by Sonny is, I know you've addressed this before, but what do you do for a living, your day job? Well, even though I'm a pretty successful podcaster, I still do have a day job working for Global Affairs Canada as a records management officer. That means that I spend a lot of time archiving and scanning documents and also finding stuff for people if they need stuff for any cases they're working on. So I'm essentially doing kind of some of my duties that I do as a podcaster, except I'm going through legal documents for old litigation cases and free trade agreements and stuff like that. If you go online, there's an old article about me that was published in 2018, which is titled Public Servant by Day and True Crime Podcaster by Night. And that's pretty much my life. I still live a double life after all these years and still have my day job with Global Affairs. I know people have asked me if I've ever wanted to quit and become a podcaster full time, but I really do like my job. It's a nice, relaxing job, and I like the work involved. And it's good to hold on to because it's a secure government job, meaning that I got a lot of benefits, and I also get a pension for after I retire. So I feel to give that up, I would have to have a huge windfall from podcasting and be able to do it full time. So at the moment, I'm still going to hold on to it, but I'm very happy living this double life and have no complaints about it at all. So our next question is from Katrina. What is your religious affiliation, if any? I appreciate that you are always respectful when describing the religious beliefs of victims/missing persons. Well, I am a Christian, and to be quite honest, I have never been a religious person throughout my life. I do not go to church. I never went to church during my childhood. But I do know a lot of people who find religion to be an important part of their life, and I totally respect that, just as long as they don't use it to harm other people. But you mentioned being respectful when describing the religious beliefs of some of the victims of my podcast, and I greatly appreciate that because I can sometimes feel that it's an important aspect of the whole case. Just a couple weeks ago, I did a case on the 2009 disappearance of Stephen Kocher, who was a very devout Mormon, and for some reason this has fueled speculation that this may have played a role in his disappearance, and that he decided to go missing voluntarily because he wanted to get away from an oppressive religion. But it's worth mentioning that Stephen seemed to really take his religion and his faith seriously and went to church all the time. He seemed really devoted to Mormonism. So I really do not believe that theory at all, that he just wanted to get away because he wanted to escape from his oppressive religion, because Stephen really seemed to like it. And I feel that same way about another case I've covered on this podcast about the 1981 disappearance of Cindy Anderson, because she hailed from a strict Christian fundamentalist family. And of course, this has caused theories that maybe she felt she was being oppressed and she wanted to get away and live her own life. But like Stephen Kocher, it sounds like Cindy was a very happy person who really liked her religion and took it seriously and would not have felt the need to run away because of it. So that's why in both these cases, I feel that the missing people became victims of foul play. And I really don't think their religion played any role in what happened to them. And our next question is asked by Amy. Has your new space affected your ability to record? If so, how? Well, in case you haven't heard, just this past year, I moved into a new condo. I had spent several years living in a bachelor apartment, so I pretty much just recorded in the living room all the time. And this new condo had a office/guest room, and I figured this is going to be a great recording space, but the first time I went in there to record an episode, I noticed there was a huge echo in the background because there's a lot of empty space, something I had never considered before while living in a bachelor's apartment. So at the moment, I record inside, pretty much between two closets. I have a hallway, and I sit in the middle of it with both closet doors open because close is used to block sound and echoes very well. Yeah, a lot of independent podcasters will tell you the same thing, that we don't live glamorous lives recording in elaborate recording studios. A lot of the time we just record in our closets, but I think it adds like a little flavor to our whole independent podcaster label, and we're quite content doing it this way. And kind of a related question asked by Diana, when will your grandmother's quilt come back? That's kind of an inside joke, but I'll explain it to those who aren't familiar with it. If you've seen me do any of my vocal sessions or my live streams, back when I was in my old apartment, I used to do it in front of a recliner that had this really nice quilt that my grandmother made for me draped over the back of the chair. And so many people kept pointing it out in the comments section that I kind of made it a tradition to put the quilt in the background every time I recorded an episode. But since I moved to my new condo, to my new recording space, that whenever I do live streams inside my office, you don't see the quilt because I don't have a recliner behind me. So one of these days I'm going to have to put it on the wall or something, or dangle it from the ceiling so that you can see it in the background of my videos, because my grandmother, I think, would be very appreciative if she knew how much her quilt has become a hit with my podcast fans. So our next question from Rupert is, nearly 7 years on, how has your life changed since you started the podcast? Well, that's a great question, because in many ways my life has changed a lot, but in other ways it hasn't changed at all. Because like I just mentioned, I'm still working my day job with Global Affairs Canada, so I just have my days like I did before, where I go to work during the day and work on my podcast during the nights and on weekends. And it's kind of a thing. It's like, you're not a celebrity, even if your podcast is a hit, because people don't know what you look like. So it's not like you go out onto the streets of Ottawa, where I live, and then get recognized by people. But it is kind of surreal whenever I go to podcasting conventions like CrimeCon, and then you get recognized by people who come up to your booth and want to take pictures with you. And sometimes they'll even approach you while you're away from Podcast Row, while you're in a bar or an elevator, and ask for a selfie. So it's pretty cool. I mean, you feel like a celebrity for a couple days out of the year, but then you can go back to living your normal life. But it is still pretty overwhelming when you find out that people from all over the world have listened to your podcast and enjoy it so much, and it's become a big part of their life. And you get emails from places like Europe and Africa and South America and Australia, and find out that you've got fans there who've listened to it so far away. It's just such a cool feeling. And another great thing about podcasting is all the new friendships I've developed with listeners and fellow podcasters. And these are people that don't live anywhere near me. They might live in completely different countries, hundreds, if not thousands of miles away, and I only get to see them in person a couple times a year, but you just develop very close friendships and are often in touch with them all the time. So it's a very unique existence where in some ways I'm just an ordinary guy living my ordinary life here in Ottawa, but then other times you just feel like, wow, I've created something really special that a lot of people enjoyed, and it's really had a positive impact on my life. So our next question from Sonny, how many cases or shows are you working on at any given time? Well, if possible, I like to prefer working on just one case at a time, just so I can keep my full focus on it, though there are other times where I might have to do multiple ones, such as if I'm doing a big case that requires lots of research, and I have to get a head start in order to put it together, but also work on other episodes so that I can make my quota of releasing one episode per week. And there are also times where I'm working on an episode for our regular feed, and also a bonus Patreon episode that comes out each month, so sometimes I have to work on both at the same time. And of course, as many of you know, I also have a spin-off show called The Path Went Chilly, which I co-host with Jules and Ashley. And sometimes I'm working on episodes of those and also new episodes of The Trail Went Cold. But the good thing about The Path Went Chilly is that I'm exclusively doing cases that were previously covered on The Trail Went Cold. So I'm only taking a second look at them. I don't have to do much additional research. So I can just refer to my old scripts and then go to record with Jules and Ashley, and we just kind of give our own thoughts and go from there. So that's how I'm able to maintain doing two shows at once. And one thing I appreciate about The Path Went Chilly is that there are a lot of cases that I've done over the years on The Trail Went Cold where there have been new developments or I've changed my thoughts on them. So this is a good chance to what I like to consider to be a Trail Went Cold director's cut, where I can take a second look at certain cases and sometimes have a completely different viewpoint. And our next question is from Trish. Which do you prefer doing, unsolved murders or missing persons? I don't really have a main preference. I like to do a mixture of both because I know there's some podcasts like The Vanished which exclusively do missing persons cases, so I like to alternate quite a bit between missing persons and murders and unexplained death. But I will say that missing persons probably drove me to start this podcast to begin with, because as many of our podcasters will tell you the same thing, but one of our biggest influences was the Charlie Project run by Megan Good, which is the internet's best database for looking up summaries about missing persons cases. And whenever I tackle a missing persons case, that's always a great startup. You just go to the Charlie Project and then read the write-up and go from there, and then do additional research to uncover more information. So yeah, even though I like doing both of them, I think I would say that Missing Persons and the Charlie's Project, along with Unsolved Mysteries, was one of my biggest influences to start The Trail Went Cold. Our next question is from Charlie. Is there any plans to remake any of your older episodes, like, for example, Aileen Conway? Well, that's a great question, because I think virtually every true crime podcaster will tell you that sometimes when they go back to listen to their earliest episodes, they cringe, because a lot of the time they're pretty rough, because we were just getting started out, we had no idea what we're doing. And I know that my first two episodes of The Trail Went Cold, Aileen Conway and the Fort Worth 3, they were recorded with a crappy headset microphone, so they're kind of difficult to listen to today. And there's some older episodes where I do stuff like smack my lips, and I still get bad reviews for stuff like that. So there are some older ones that sometimes I feel I should go back and remake. But that's kind of how The Path Went Chilly exists, because I can do new versions of older episodes in which I felt were pretty rough, and kind of have a new viewpoint on these cases. So I've selected quite a few of them to be covered on The Path Went Chilly. If there's one early episode I would like to do an all-new episode for, it might be episode 4, where I covered the murder of Rhonda Hinson, Because I know that in recent years, a local journalist wrote like an extensive series of articles about that case, which I think was something like 30 to 35 parts long. Like it was just like an epic and had so much new information that I didn't know before when I did my Trail Went Cold episode. So one of these days, I would like to get all the information from that and do an all-new episode on Rhonda Hinson to take a fresh look at the case. But I guess at the moment, I just don't have time because I'm so focused on producing new episodes. But maybe someday I'll take a fresh look at it and some of the other cases that I've covered on early episodes of my podcast. So our next question is from Leo. When you first did the podcast, you would always give your thoughts on what you personally think happened and who did it. Recently, unless you're positive, it seems like you haven't done that. Just curiously why. Yes, in recent years, like, if you listen to my earliest episodes, at the end I would often outline a theory from beginning to end about what I think happened. I don't do that as much in recent episodes unless it's a case I'm 100% sure what happened, but there's some cases where I'm just not sure and I'm reluctant to put together a scenario. And I think the main reason I'm like that these days is because there's always the risk you can be seriously wrong. Because we are talking about real people here, and if you want to accuse someone of being guilty of a crime, you better be 100% sure to avoid potential legal issues if you're wrong. I guess I've become more cautious because over the years we've seen a lot of cases get solved where the resolution was completely different than what most people expected. Just offhand, a few cases that have been solved in recent years include the murder of Isabel Celis, the murder of Brittany Drexel, the murder of Faith Hedgepath, where over the years, online sleuths and sometimes podcasters have accused people from the victims' personal lives of being responsible for what happened to them, and then they wound up arresting a suspect who had never been on the radar before, and it turns out that they may have been the victim of a completely random crime from a random perpetrator. So if you accused innocent people on earlier episodes of murder, it kind of is pretty cringeworthy to go back and listen to it, and that's why I've been so cautious and why I don't try to give like a concrete theory about what happened unless I'm absolutely sure, because some cases there just isn't enough certainty about what happened to make one of those predictions. So our next question is from Jeff and Tara Lynn of the Cold Case Central podcast. We love your analysis of the cases you cover. Do you have a template you follow for deducing what might have happened, or is your analysis just thoughts off the top of your head? Well, I would say that in my earliest episodes, I mostly gave thoughts off the top of my head, but as I've gone on and done more and more episodes and looked at more cases, I do kind of have a template for looking at pieces of evidence and stuff like that because I kind of notice a pattern that happens in a lot of cases. I know they always say for deaths, when police always answer them when they arrive at a scene, they say that you should always start off by assuming that the death was a homicide and only waver away from that direction and assume it's a suicide or an accidental death if that's where the evidence takes you. And unfortunately, in some cases, that doesn't happen, where cases that are ruled to be suicide or accidents, even though they were obvious homicides. And I kind of have that formula when I look at cases on The Trail Went Cold, where I see what happened and I think, okay, here are all the different scenarios. How likely is this scenario here? And if they're suspects, I look at each of them and say, okay, what is the likelihood that this person could have done it? And we have key pieces of evidence, like if it's a missing persons case and we have eyewitness sightings, we know that in the majority of these cases, eyewitness sightings are going to be mistaken. So I have to think, okay, how likely is it that that witness is telling the truth and is accurate about what they saw? And if we're looking at stuff like suicides or accidental deaths, where I start to the scenario is like, okay, if this was a murder, could someone have pulled it off? Would they have been able to kill someone in this fashion and make it look like a suicide or an accident? So that's just a few examples of kind of the template that I like to follow when I'm putting together these cases. And a lot of the time, I use that to arrive to a conclusion. Though there are other examples where some cases are so baffling where I really can't come up with a concrete theory to explain what happened because nothing fits together. So our next question is from Sonny. Has there been a case where you've had preconceived thoughts to what had happened, but after researching you change your mind or opinion? Oh yeah, that sort of thing happens all the time when I put together episodes, and I think the best examples of this are cases that were featured on Unsolved Mysteries, because there are times where I've watched them on the show, come to my own preconceived opinion about what happened, but then when I do additional research to put together an episode and learn facts that were not mentioned on Unsolved Mysteries, I can sometimes change my mind. There are two cases that I've done this past year on the podcast where they were presented on Unsolved Mysteries. They were both deemed to be suspicious suicides, but their families believed that they were murdered. But once you dug in deeper into these cases, you were like, maybe they really were suicides after all. A prime example of this is the death of Andre Jones, who was a young black kid who was taken into custody by police during a traffic stop and taken to jail, and then he was found hanging in a shower stall. And even though it was ruled to be a suicide, his family believed that he had been murdered, because we're talking about a black kid who was arrested in one of the most racist parts of Mississippi by white police officers, so of course he had to have been murdered and the suicide was staged. But once I looked into some details from the case in newspaper articles and police reports, which were not mentioned on Unsolved Mysteries, I was like, wow, it looks like this was probably a suicide after all. And if it was a homicide, it would have needed to be a conspiracy involving dozens of people who have managed to remain silent for over 30 years. So I found it very unlikely that he had been murdered. And another example just like that is the Danny Casolaro case, which I covered this year, where he's found in a bathtub in a hotel room and with his wrist slashed, and he was supposedly trying to uncover this big story about a government conspiracy, and his family believed that he was murdered and his suicide was staged. And of course, I watched it on Unsolved Mysteries all those years ago and figured Danny was a victim of foul play. But then you go deeper into the case and you realize, the homicide theory doesn't really make a lot of sense. There are some logical pieces of evidence pointing towards suicide. I mean, that's a case where I can't say with 100% certainty that Danny's death was a suicide, but I am closer to thinking that way after uncovering a whole bunch of facts and pieces of evidence which were not mentioned on Unsolved Mysteries. So those are just two examples of cases where I have my own preconceived thoughts about what happened, but then changed my mind when I did additional research. So another question from Sonny, which is a bit similar to the last one, so I'll answer it right now. Have you ever been surprised by previously unknown details you learned while researching? Yeah, this happens quite a bit when I do older cases on the podcast, because when you're talking about mysteries that took place several decades ago, like the 40s and the 50s, you run into the problem where certain inaccuracies are repeated so often over the years that they're repeated as fact. One example of something I was surprised to discover was when I did my Halloween episode about the Who Put Bella in the Witch Elm case, about the unidentified woman whose skeletal remains were found inside a hollow tree in England in 1943. The case got a lot of notoriety because a bunch of graffiti soon started showing up around the area which read, "Who put Bella in the witch elm?" And they were assumed that the person who wrote it might have had knowledge about who this woman was and possibly been involved in her murder. While researching it, I was surprised to discover some old newspaper articles from the 1950s where it said that police found the man who had written the original graffiti, and they pretty much determined that he was a crank who only did it as a practical joke and had no knowledge or involvement in the crime. But not a lot of people know this. Nobody really reports on this detail. And I think it's because over the years there have been repeat instances where people have put up that same graffiti that people just accept that it has a connection to this case. But no, it's just kind of an urban legend. And the graffiti was originally written by someone who had nothing to do with the case. So it really doesn't have any relevance to her death at all. Going back to Unsolved Mysteries, one of the cases on there where I was surprised to discover some unknown details was the disappearance of 4-year-old Marlena Childress, which took place in Tennessee in 1987, and I covered it on episode number 90 of the podcast. This was a case which only aired on Unsolved Mysteries once before I believe her family asked them never to air it again, so it's kind of a rare one. And I know that the Unsolved Mysteries segment focused heavily on some sightings of Marlena in a beauty parlor with these two unidentified women that supposedly took place a long time after she went missing and suggested she was still alive. But then when you go back through the newspaper archives, I was surprised to discover, oh, they actually tracked down these women, and it turned out that the girl who was with her was not actually Marlena after all. So I have no idea why Unsolved Mysteries continued to show this on a lead that was obviously dead. So you get surprised like that about that sometimes when you're researching these cases and find a lot of new details that cause you to look at the case in a totally different light. So our next question is from Jennifer. I would love to know your thoughts on the Stephen Avery case. I have gone back and forth many times on his guilt or innocence, and am very curious of any thoughts or insight that you may have on the case. I found it very impactful when Kathleen Zellner took his case, as I feel she would not have taken it if she felt he was guilty. I have heard her say to him, if you are guilty, you do not want me on your case because I will expose your guilt. Man, I really don't know where to start with this case, as I have personally gone back and forth on it many times. To give you my personal history, I was familiar with the Stephen Avery case before Making a Murderer. I knew he was the guy who had served 18 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit, and then was charged and convicted of another murder less than 2 years after he was exonerated of the rape conviction and released from prison. So when I saw the title Making a Murderer, I thought this was going to be an in-depth look about how being sent to prison for a crime he didn't commit really hardened Stephen Avery and changed him and turned him into such a bad person that he committed murder shortly after he was released. But then I was surprised when they were presenting this narrative about how they believed he was wrongly convicted a second time, did not commit the murder, and that the police planted evidence in order to frame him. And I was into it, but after Making a Murderer ended, I was like, okay, they didn't really present an alternate scenario about who else could have murdered Teresa Halbach. And I started digging in about stuff that they left out of there and began to think, yeah, he was probably guilty all along. But like you just said, when Kathleen Zellner agreed to take over the case, my eyebrows rose because I followed her work for years. I know that she did amazing work on the Ryan Ferguson case, getting him exonerated and released from prison. And she's helped a lot of other wrongly convicted people get out of prison and was considered to be one of the top lawyers in that field. So I'm thinking, even though this is a high-profile case, if she took Stephen Avery's case and he really was actually guilty, this would do a lot of damage to her reputation. So I was kind of hoping that she had done her due diligence and had convincing evidence to show that Avery was actually innocent. I did watch Making a Murderer 2 a couple years later, where they presented the alternate scenario where Bobby Dassey, Brendan Dassey's brother, could have been responsible for this. And I'm like, okay, that's fairly plausible. I mean, I could see this. I'm not 100% convinced that Stephen Avery is innocent, but this at least presents an alternative scenario. And I still feel strongly that even if Avery is guilty, that some of the evidence may have been planted, that the police may have had such a hard-on for him that they figured, we know he's guilty, but we're going to plant some evidence just to be sure. I do think that there was some suspicious stuff and some misconduct in this case, so even if he is guilty, I think Avery is entitled to a new trial. That's the thing, is I do not think he's a good person. He has done some bad things in his life, and obviously that incident during his youth where he threw a cat into a fire and burned him alive really paints a terrible picture of him. But that's the thing. If you look into the background of the Averys, there are a lot of terrible people in that family. Like, just look into the background of Stephen's brothers, who have been arrested on a number of different charges and have been accused of some horrible things. So that's why I'm thinking, if Teresa Halbach got murdered after visiting the Avery salvage yard, there are other people in that family who lived on that property, who frequented that property, who could have killed her, besides Stephen, which is why I don't think the Bobby Dassey theory is that implausible. So I don't know. I could tackle this one on the podcast, but I don't know where to start. So hopefully as the years go on, we do get more conclusive evidence that sheds some light on this and determines beyond a shadow of a doubt if Stephen Avery actually committed this crime. So our next question is from Darren, all the way in New Zealand, and he asks my thoughts on Scott Peterson. There's been some talk in the true crime community of his innocence, which blows my mind. What are your thoughts on this case? Well, unlike Stephen Avery, I really do not have much ambiguity on Scott Peterson. I think he's guilty as sin. And I have seen there's kind of like an onslaught of people trying to push forward the possibility that he's innocent. I have watched that documentary series that was produced a few years ago about the case, which was financed by his family members, so it was heavily biased and left out a lot of damning evidence against him. And I do agree with the notion that the case, again, against him was circumstantial, and because this case got a lot of media coverage, it would have been difficult for him to secure a fair trial. But at the same time, I just cannot overlook the sheer coincidence that he would decide to go fishing on Christmas Eve at this location that was a great distance away from where he lived, and where the bodies of his wife and his unborn son would be found in the water months after the fact. So I know there's no damning smoking gun like DNA evidence to prove that he did it, but I think the totality of the circumstantial evidence proves that Scott Peterson is guilty and right where he belongs. But all that being said, I know he was sentenced to death, and I'm not someone who believes in the death penalty, and I'm uncomfortable to see executions carried out on convictions that were based on circumstantial evidence, just in case there is some doubt. So I do not have any desire to see Peterson executed, but I am content to see him remain in prison for the rest of his life. So our next question is from Rupert. Have you heard of the Range Rover Rettenton murders? If so, do you think that Michael Steele and Jack Holmes were the men who committed the crime, or were they wrongfully convicted? Well, congratulations, Rupert. You completely stumped me, because this is a case I had not heard of before you sent in this email, so I had to go look it up on Wikipedia to find out the details. So, for those of you who haven't heard of it, this crime took place on December the 6th, 1995, in the village of Rettenton, England, and it involved 3 drug dealers named Tony Tucker, Patrick Tate, and Craig Rolfe, all being shot to death in a Range Rover before 2 suspects named Jack Holmes and Michael Steele were charged with the murders, and they would be convicted just over 2 years later and sentenced to life imprisonment. Looking at the details, it appears that Jack Holmes was released from prison in January of 2021 on parole after serving 23 years, but Michael Steele is still incarcerated. There's been a lot of debate about if these were the right guys and whether or not they were wrongly convicted, and unfortunately at this particular point in time, I cannot give you my honest opinion because I haven't dived fully enough into this case, but thanks for sending it my way. Maybe I'll tackle it on a future Trail Went Cold episode. And this next question is sent in by one of my regular listeners, Damian Nichols. And no, that's not Damian Eccles from the West Memphis 3, but he says that people get confused all the time. And he says, do you have any current plans to cover in what my opinion is the strangest disappearance in the modern era? The vanishing of Brian Schaefer. It's such a compelling mystery, and I've always wanted to hear your take on it. Yes, the Brian Schaefer case is definitely one of my most highly requested cases to cover since the inception of this podcast. And in case you're not familiar with it, it took place in Columbus, Ohio in 2006 and involved a young medical student named Brian Schaefer who went to a bar in the downtown area, and even though the security camera showed him entering the bar, it did not show him leaving, and he has not been seen ever since. And people have always wondered, how did he get out of the bar and what happened to him? I definitely would like to cover it on The Trail Went Cold, but I would probably have to wait for the right time because this is one of those missing persons cases that has been covered so extensively on television and on podcasts, and there is just so much information that it will require a lot of research and a lot of work. I know that other podcasts, I know True Crime Garage in particular has covered it extensively because they are based in the Columbus area and talk to a lot of the people involved in it. And this is another one of those cases where there has been a lot of misinformation spread that has been accepted as fact. So if I was to put together an episode, it would require a lot of extra work trying to find out what the true facts of this case are. That's the thing with these high-profile missing persons cases that have been covered so much, is that if you want to cover them on your own podcast, you really don't know where to start, and you always hope, is there something new that I can contribute that other forms of media have not? But all that being said, I would love to cover Brian Schaefer on The Trail Went Cold at some point, because that one completely perplexes me. With the information that I know, I really don't have a logical explanation to explain what happened to him. Our next question is from Trish. Doing famous cases, why not do the Tylenol murders of 1982, which affected everyone? Yes, I have received a lot of requests to cover the Tylenol murders. It's one of the most famous unsolved crimes of the 1980s, where someone decided to lace some Tylenol with potassium cyanide, and when people started buying it and ingesting it, and they found out there was a mass poisoning epidemic took place, this led to all Tylenol being recalled and the installation of child-proof caps on these bottles to ensure that something like this never happened again. I mean, I wouldn't mind covering it, but it's like, much like Brian Schaefer, it's one of those cases which has been covered so extensively, and there's just so much new information available that I wouldn't know where to start, and I'm not sure what I could offer that other forms of media have not already done. Just to make a comparison, one reason I decided to do my 6-year anniversary episode on the Alcatraz escape from 1962 earlier this year is because even though it is such a famous mystery, I was surprised to discover that it hasn't been covered all that much on true crime podcasts. So I thought, this is my time to tackle it and provide my own accounting of it, and that's why I wasn't hesitant to do it, even though it's such a big case. But with stuff like the Tylenol murders, it's pretty much been done to death, and I always have this mentality, if I'm going to cover it, at least I hope that I can offer something new. So our next question is from Jeremy. Would you be willing to cover this story on one of your Halloween episodes? It's the story of the Polaroid ghostwriter. Unlike many paranormal incidents, I feel this one has some credibility to be either 100% or authentic or an elaborate hoax. I'd love to hear your take. Well, honestly, I had actually never heard of this story until you sent it my way, but it's a pretty weird one. In case you're not familiar with it, it took place in Los Angeles during the early 1990s, where a family got a new Polaroid and started taking pictures inside their house, and discovered that a bunch of weird images that looked like ghosts started appearing in their photographs, and soon words would actually start forming in midair on their photographs. And surprisingly, I'm surprised Unsolved Mysteries didn't actually cover this one, because it sounds like it would be right up your alley. And I know it's possible that it could have been an elaborate hoax, but I haven't done enough research to determine if they found any evidence to prove that. But I do sometimes cover the odd paranormal case on The Trail Went Cold if I feel that it's hard to come up with a logical explanation for everything, which is why I once did an episode on Dawn Rainbow Decker. I find that story fascinating. A lot of the times I'll do the supernatural themed cases as Patreon exclusive bonus episodes. I know this past Halloween I did one about the Falcon Lake UFO incident from the 1960s, because that's a tough one to explain. So who knows, maybe one of these days I will do an episode around about the Polaroid ghostwriter, because I like to do some of those weird stories around Halloween. So our next question is from Rupert. What's your theory on Jennifer Kessie's case? In case you're not familiar with this case, it took place in Orlando, Florida in January of 2006. Jennifer Kessie was a 24-year-old woman who vanished after leaving her apartment complex to go to work. And then a couple days later, a security camera would capture an unidentified man parking her car near the area and climbing out. But what's frustrating is that each time the camera captured images, the individual's face just happened to be obscured by stuff like a fence. So they were never able to make a positive ID. And after 16 years, we just still have no idea who this man is. So the Jennifer Kessie disappearance has been covered on a lot of podcasts, and I've received a lot of requests to cover it on The Trail Went Cold, though I haven't done my own episode yet. It's been a while since I fully researched the case, but I remember at the time I leaned towards the theory that she was harmed by an undocumented worker. There were a lot of workers who were performing construction at her apartment complex around the time she disappeared, and a lot of them were undocumented workers from Mexico, and so it was impossible for police to question all of them about her disappearance. So it's possible that whoever harmed her and parked her car and walked past the security camera may have disappeared into Mexico or another country shortly thereafter, in which case it would be very difficult to track them down. I do hope they solve this case one day, but I think it's reasonable to state that whoever harmed Jennifer and parked her car is one of the luckiest perpetrators in the history of mankind, because it's pretty much a miracle that they were able to walk past that camera and somehow avoid getting their face captured and avoid being identified. So our next question is from Catherine. This year, a few people close to my family and friends have suddenly died due to previously unknown health conditions such as heart attacks, and this got me wondering, are there any unsolved missing persons cases that you think could be explained by natural causes? Or perhaps even cases where the skeletal remains were found and a proper autopsy couldn't be done? Well, interestingly enough, I was just thinking about this topic while watching an Unsolved Mysteries episode about a case that was covered during the last season, which doesn't get much discussion, and I might cover it on The Trail Went Cold at some point, and that's the 1997 death of 16-year-old Natasha Jennings. That's a very odd one because there are a number of different scenarios to try to explain how she died, but none of them make 100% complete sense. I know there was speculation that she was a victim of foul play, but there's no evidence to point in that direction. There was also speculation that she may have died of a drug overdose, but they didn't find any traces of drugs in her system. So watching it, I personally believe that she might have had some sort of undiagnosed medical condition that nobody knew about that suddenly caused her to die, and because she was never officially diagnosed, they've never been able to figure this out, which is why her death is still technically unsolved. And I sometimes think about this involving missing persons cases where they find the victim's remains, but they are unable to determine the exact cause of death. I mean, if they're found in a wilderness area, then it's reasonable to assume that they might have gotten lost or died of exposure, but I think there probably are some cases where they may have died of natural causes, such as a heart attack, and they've just been unable to determine this because there's nothing left but skeletal remains. Another prime example of this, which was covered on Unsolved Mysteries, and I also covered on episode number 145 of The Trail Went Cold, was the unexplained death of Devin Williams, a truck driver who decided to go off his route and drive his semi-trailer truck into a national forest in Arizona before he ran away from his truck and disappeared. And years later, they found his skull inside a wooded area, but were unable to determine the cause of death. But because a lot of the witnesses who saw Devin said he was acting very strangely, it seems likely that he just had some sort of medical condition that he didn't know about, his family didn't know about, and it just caused him to behave erratically, drive into this forest, and then just disappear. And while he may have actually died of exposures, we may never know the medical condition that caused him to go to this area to begin with. So that is another case that I think of where I think a lot of these missing people do die of natural causes, but if their bodies are never found or they only find skeletal remains, it's just impossible to determine that with 100% certainty. So our next question from Sani, has there ever been a case that you didn't enjoy working on and was glad when you had finished? You don't have to say which case, I'm just wondering if any were a drudge to work on. I actually can't think of any. I mean, there's some cases that are really dark and depressing, so I was glad to complete it just so that I can move on to something that just wasn't so disturbing to work on. But I can't say there were any real cases where I just hated working on them and was glad I was done, because I do enjoy putting them together, even if they're dark cases. Just the whole process of researching, writing, and putting everything together into a coherent script is a process that I really do like. But I think the one case where I was glad it was finished was the Tommy Ziegler case. Not because I didn't enjoy it immensely, just because it was so difficult to do because it is so convoluted. And I also was consulting with his defense investigator, Lynn Marie Carty, and learning new information and changing stuff all the time and re-recording lines and editing everything together that we had. I know it was a 2-part episode, and after I finished part 1, I had to delay the release of part 2 for a couple weeks because I had to just do so many revisions and so much polishing everything. So I was glad when I was finally done on it, and that's why I moved on to something a lot easier. But in the end, it's still one of the series I'm most proud to have done on this podcast, and I wouldn't change it for anything. So our next question is from Ian. Have you ever pulled back on a story because it was too hard to do? Not research-wise, just... Well, yeah, there's some cases where I don't think I've gone too deep into one where I've written a script and then just decided I don't want to record this anymore, I'm just dropping this. But there's some cases where I look at them and just see all the details and briefly start doing research and then decide to myself saying, you know what, this is just way too dark and disturbing and I'm going to hate working on this, so I'm electing not to cover it. I have done quite a few cases on this podcast about missing and murdered children, and those are the most difficult to do. I can generally handle them, but the ones that I am reluctant to cover are the ones where the child has obviously been the victim of nonstop abuse over a prolonged period of time by their caregiver, and where there isn't really much of a mystery, where it seems obvious that they were murdered by the person, by their legal guardian, but because they disposed of the child's body and there's no physical evidence to prove foul play, they've been unable to make an arrest, so the case is still technically unsolved. But yeah, you do any research on that, you're going to find a lot of cases of that example where you can tell that the child was subject to constant abuse throughout their life and just led a very difficult life in general. And when I see those, it's like, wow, I know that these missing children need exposure, but these are just too difficult to do. And that's why you're not going to find too many of those stories on this podcast. So our next question is from Aaron. Have you come across some cases that you wanted to cover, but discovered there is little to no information about them? Would you consider doing an episode with multiple cases like this? Oh, I run into this all the time, where I uncover very interesting cases, or people will send suggestions for cases, and then I'll try to find information, and there's just so little out there. And some cases, people go missing or they're murdered, and there is just no information to work with, no leads, so that I knew that if I do a podcast episode about it, it would probably be no longer than 10 minutes. But I have tried to compensate for this in many years. Like, I started off by releasing cases like this as shorter minisodes that were between 15 to 20 minutes. And once I stopped doing minisodes, if I found cases that didn't have enough material for a full episode, I would just combine them both and do 2 cases on the same podcast. I tried something a little different from the norm earlier this year when I released episode number 295 about missing and murdered Indigenous women from Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. Each of these cases did not have much information, so I decided to do something unprecedented and cover 9 unsolved cold cases on the same podcast. And that episode seemed to go over really well. A lot of people really enjoyed it, so I may try something like that again next year, where I decide to cover a bunch of cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women from the same province or general area, and just talk about them all, where even if there isn't a lot of individual information about each case, I can talk about certain topics like systemic issues that led to their disappearance and police investigations that aren't handled very well, and just combine them together into one topic. So yeah, if I ever run into that where I find cases where there's just so little information, I will try combining them together into one episode about the same general topic. Our next question is from Ben. Is there any one case you're fascinated by but don't think you could do justice because the primary source documents are all in another language? Or put another way, what case, if you had the chance, would you magically change all the documentation of to well-written English so you could cover it? Yes, this is an issue that I run into where I learn about very interesting cases from other non-English language speaking countries, but it's tough to find too many sources that are in English. One case that I covered several years ago was episode number 77 about the disappearance, or about the strange death of Paulette Habara Farah, a 4-year-old girl who was found underneath her bed in Mexico in 2010. And even though I was able to find a lot of English language documents about it, I found out that they did not tell the whole story and that there was some very interesting information you could not find unless you search through the Spanish language documents. So that's an episode where if I could redo it, I would definitely do it over again. And it's kind of shied me away from covering cases that are from countries where most of the sources are not in English. One case that I find fascinating and would really like to cover is the 2008 Noida double murder case, which took place in Noida, India, and involved the murders of a 13-year-old girl named Arushi Talwar and a 45-year-old live-in domestic worker employed by the family named Hemraj Banjed. Arushi's parents would be charged and convicted of the crime. They suspected that they decided to murder their daughter as some sort of honor killing because she was having an affair with the domestic servant, so both of them were killed. But there's been a lot of controversy about how the investigation was handled, and their convictions have been overturned, and it's still considered to be an unsolved murder to this day. There is definitely no shortage of information about this case on the internet, and a lot of the source documents are in English, which is a good thing. But I'm sure there's other material that is not available in English, and I feel that unless I could see it all, it would be difficult to see the full story of this case and do an episode that does it justice. But that's kind of like my holy grail someday, that I would like to cover it on the podcast because it is a very fascinating story, and I'm really not sure how I fall on it about the parents' guilt or innocence. So our next question is from Trish. How old does a case have to be for you to do an episode? There really is no limit. I think the oldest one that I have covered on The Trail Went Cold is the disappearance of Ambrose Small, which took place in Toronto all the way back in 1919. As you know, I like to do old cases on The Trail Went Cold because I love diving into older eras to see how the world and crime-solving techniques were so much different back then. I don't know if there's any limit. I do want to know that one of the issues when you're doing cases that took place centuries ago is that it's hard to find reliable information because the source documents are all gone, and the story gets told so many times that, and the details passed down through the generations, that you don't know what's true and what's misinformation. fiction. But who knows? Like, I can't write out the possibility that I could go back to the 1800s and do like an old mystery such as, say, the Mary Celeste. So I won't write off that possibility, but I'm one of those podcasters who does not shy away from doing older cases. So our next question is from Jessica. Have you ever considered doing a long-form podcast? Yours is my favorite short form, but love me some multi-episode arcs. I have thought about it, but I think the one thing that holds me back is that I want to do so many cases, because when I started this podcast, I had a list of cases I wanted to cover that was like literally hundreds, and I still think to myself that even if I do this podcast for 30 years, I'll never be able to cover all the cases I want to do. And I think that's just not my thing, is that I don't want to spend so much time just focusing on one case to be able to work on a long-form podcast for a prolonged period of time. I certainly wouldn't write off the possibility of doing a long-form podcast in the future, but for now, I'm more content just doing my regular formula of one case per episode per week. Our next question is from Blair. In the past several years, a few different cases covered on the podcast have been the subject of long-form podcasts, such as David Box and Kelly Day Wilson. Which cases would you like to see someone do in a long-form podcast format? Well, thank you for telling me about the Kelly Day Wilson long-form podcast, which is called Deviltown, which I had no idea existed until you told me, so I'll have to give that one a listen. And yes, that would have been one of my candidates, because I think that's a very odd case that could be the subject for a lot of discussion. Another one that has actually recently been done was the Feeney family murders, which I covered on the podcast earlier this year, which I think is a very underrated and overlooked case. But the podcast Ozark's True Crime has recently released a multi-episode series about the Feeney family murders, so I'm glad to see that. One case that I think could be the subject of a very interesting long-form podcast, which I don't see talked about nearly enough, but that's the murder of Doreen Pickard and the attempted murder of Susan Laferte, which took place in Woonsocket, Rhode Island in February of 1982. I covered that one all the way back on episode number 22 of The Trail Went Cold, and of course it was subject to one of the earliest episodes of Unsolved Mysteries. And if you see an update on that episode, it mentions that a suspect named Raymond Beaver Tempest was eventually convicted of Doreen's murder, and they say that he has since been released, but they don't actually give the full story there, because his conviction was actually overturned, and he was released from prison, and both sides ultimately agreed for him to enter an Alford plea where he would plead guilty while maintaining his innocence, so the case is essentially closed. I mean, I covered that one. My episode was about 40 to 45 minutes long, but it had a lot of information. But I feel like this case deserves a second look, because even though Beaver Tempest did agree to take the Alford plea, he still maintains that he was innocent and wrongfully convicted. And there are just so many crazy side stories involving that case, with stuff like police corruption, and there's an alternate suspect that some people believe committed the crime, that I think it deserves a new look at some point, and I would love to see it on a long-form podcast to really help people determine who they really believe committed this crime. Our next question is from Lori. Given how much the podcasting world has changed in quality, quantity of podcasts, etc., how do you strive to make The Trail Went Cold stand out among the crowd? Well, that's a really interesting question, because when I started out in early 2016, there were just so few podcasts out there, so few true crime podcasts to choose from. So people were willing to give me a chance because I was doing something different, and that's when my formula was pretty much based on covering a lot of cases that were featured on Unsolved Mysteries and going into much more in depth about them. But ever since then, they have finally re-released the old seasons of Unsolved Mysteries on Amazon Prime and YouTube, whereas when I started The Trail Went Cold, you couldn't watch those episodes anywhere, so people were looking at my podcast as a substitute. And ever since then, there have been a lot of podcasts that have exclusively covered Unsolved Mysteries cases. And of course, now there's an old Unsolved Mysteries podcast, and we have the Unsolved Mysteries reboot on Netflix. So obviously, I couldn't just continue to follow that formula. I had to cover a lot of cases that were outside Unsolved Mysteries in order to make The Trail Went Cold stand out. And to continue standing out, I think one of my formulas is just try to do as many cases I can that people haven't heard of before, or have not been covered, or been covered very few times on other podcasts. One of the reasons I decided to do the Alcatraz special earlier this year is because it had not been covered on a lot of podcasts. So I thought that if I did a two-part series, it would stand out. And a lot of people feel that if I do cover a case that has been featured a lot of times and has been heavily analyzed, they pretty much figure that I'm probably going to bring something new to the table. I'm just not going to do the same old analysis and the same old recaps. And just as a recent example, there's the Stephen Kocher case, which has been a heavily covered case on a lot of podcasts, but I included a lot of new information that a lot of people have not heard before, and that's why I think my episode stood out more than usual. So that's advice that I give to all aspiring podcasters these days, is because the field is so crowded and it's so difficult to stand out from the pack, just try to do something that hasn't been done before. Just don't cover the same old cases that everyone else has done, and do something that will make your podcast feel unique. So a question here from John: do you have any pet peeves in podcasting? Well, yes, and one of the things I really hate is when I discover a podcast that is covering a very interesting case, but they spend most of the time talking about stuff like their personal lives and getting off on unrelated tangents, and you find out that they pretty much did the bare minimum of research and are pretty much only reading the Wikipedia summary or the Charlie Project summary, and do not have anything really unique to offer about the case. And I'm not calling out anyone in particular, but I know there have been some examples where I do a Google search on a case that I covered on The Trail Went Cold, and then I'll find some smaller podcast that I've never heard of before, and it's like, oh yeah, they're covering this case. I want to listen to this because I'm anxious to hear their take, because this isn't a case that a lot of people talk about. And then I'll listen to the episode, and they'll spend like the first 10 or 15 minutes talking about stuff like how their toilet is broken, or they got a new coffee maker, just stuff about their personal life that I don't really care about, and they spend like as little time as possible talking about the case, which is what I really want to learn. So I think to myself, I'm not listening to this podcast again if this is what it's going to be like. I think that's a mistake that a lot of newer podcasters make, because obviously one of the most successful podcasts out there is My Favorite Murder, and the two hosts, George and Karen, do spend a lot of time talking about their personal lives and stuff that has nothing to do with the case. But I think the key difference is that they already had a built-in audience. A lot of people knew who Karen and Georgia were before they even started My Favorite Murder, and they built up such a huge fan base that their listeners are tolerant about hearing them talk about their personal lives and are interested in it, and that's why they keep doing it. Whereas if you're a new person starting a podcast and no one knows who you are, then nobody's going to care when you talk about stuff that's going on in your life. So I think that's a trap that some newer podcasters fall into, and my big piece of advice is, if you're going to be covering cases, talk about the case. Spend as little time as possible talking about yourself, and that's how you might build an audience and draw a lot of interest. So our next question is from Mike. How many other true crime podcasts do you follow? Well, one of the drawbacks of hosting your own true crime podcast is that you have very little time of your own to listen to as many podcasts as you'd like. And there are a lot of podcasts out there where I do listen to episodes, but I don't think there are any of them where I listen to every single episode. It's almost like a case-by-case basis where I have so little free time to myself to listen to other podcasts that I'll just be kind of choosy and say, oh, this is an episode about a topic that I find really interesting. I'll listen to this one. But ones where I listen to most of the episodes are usually run by friends of mine, stuff like Generation Y, which is one of the OGs, which I've been following for years. I still listen to stuff like Crime Lines by Charlie, Already Gone, The Vanished, Trace Evidence. So yeah, it's kind of like a case-by-case basis where I'll follow a lot of podcasts, but I'll generally only listen to the episodes if it's a topic that intrigues me, just because of my time management. So our next question is from Diana. What is one other podcast you would like to do a joint episode with, and what case would it be? I know that I've been pretty blessed when it comes to doing joint episodes, because two of the biggest influences I had for starting a podcast my own was Generation Y and Thinking Sideways, which sadly is no longer around, but I got to do a voice cameo on a special joint episode with Thinking Sideways, which was pretty cool. And I was honored when Aaron asked me to co-host a special episode of Generation Y about a year and a half ago, where we talked about the Holly Staker case, and it was still surreal to me that one of the podcasts I grew up listening, that I was being the guest co-host for one episode, so I will always be grateful for that. I've also done a bunch of Patreon bonus episodes with Charlie from Crime Lines, who is always a delight to discuss with, and would love to do more episodes with her. And I've done some other great podcasts I like. I was once a guest on the Resolved Mysteries podcast, hosted by 3 women who talk about unsolved mysteries episodes. And sadly, they're also no longer around, but I was honored when they asked me to do an appearance on one of their episodes. One podcaster I haven't worked with yet, but I think might be pretty cool, would be Stephen Pacheco from Trace Evidence, because he and I always get a lot of requests saying that, when are you and Robin going to do an episode together? Because we both have the same similar formats where we talk about unsolved cold cases, where you share the details about the case itself, and then we talk about our theories and provide our analysis. So obviously we have the same audiences and the same listener base. We're both very busy people who are constantly working on our episodes, so we would have to make a lot of time to do it, but it would be cool if we were able to do a joint episode at some point. And for what case it would be, one case I would love to do with any other podcasters I know is just talk about my passion case, the Tommy Ziegler case, just because it is such a convoluted, crazy story that I would love to hear my thoughts and get do a discussion with some of the other podcasters I know about it, because I don't know how deeply familiar they are with that case. It was pretty cool doing it on The Path Went Chilly with my co-hosts Jules and Ashley and getting their reactions to learning about this case for the first time. So it's kind of an open door. I would love to discuss this case on an episode with other podcasters who are interested in it, though I wouldn't want to force anyone to do it because it is just so convoluted and requires so much research that I don't want to punish anyone by making them dive down that rabbit hole if they're too busy and do not have a lot of time. And our next question is from Lori. What keeps you motivated to keep on doing the podcast? P.S. I hope you never ever quit The Trail Went Cold, because that would be a sad, sad day for all your fans. Well, good news. I don't have any plans to quit The Trail Went Cold anytime soon, so you can relax on that thing. But I think what keeps me motivated is that I am just kind of a natural creator who always loves to create things. I've been like that ever since I was a kid, because I was the type of person who would write stories and work on screenplays. I always wanted to be a scriptwriter, and I would write screenplays during my spare time when other people were going out and socializing, and that's why I wound up getting a postgraduate degree in scriptwriting. And after that, I would do stuff like write articles for crack.com and listverse.com, and then I got to the idea to start a true crime podcast, and it did take off, and I still have a huge fan base, and that's why I keep doing it after all these years. It's probably because I just love writing. I mean, I know some podcasts will hire writers to write the scripts for them, but that's not something I plan to do, because writing is my favorite aspect of podcasting. I love researching, gathering all the material, and putting it together into a coherent script, and I think that's what motivates me to keep going. I don't want to say that writing a script for a podcast is easy, because it certainly isn't, but when compared to writing scripts for try to do screenplays for a movie or a TV show where you're having to come up with plots and characters from scratch and make them all flow together, writing a script about real-life events where you don't have to dream anything up on your own, it seems like almost like a break after spending so many years coming up with fictional stories to actually write about real-life events, and that's why I love doing it. Our next question here is from Damien. Also, being a wrestling fan, if you're still into the current product, who are some of your favorite modern stars in the pro wrestling world today? Well, a couple years ago, I never thought I'd say this, but Roman Reigns is one of my all-time favorite wrestlers to watch right now. I know it was kind of a disaster so many years because the WWE tried to push them as their big babyface hero, but they were rejected by the fans. But then they finally turned him heel 2 years ago, and he's been their champion ever since, and he's just a delight to watch. He's just killing it as a heel, and I know it's going to be such a big deal when someone finally does beat him for the title. Some of my other favorites, Edge, of course, is one of my all-time favorites, and he's come out of retirement and is still wrestling today. And of course, I'm super biased because he's from my hometown of Orangeville, Ontario, Canada, and we went to the same high school, so it's great to see him still going. Always been a huge fan of Bryan Danielson. I think he's one of the best overall performers of the past 20 years. Big fan of Seth Rollins. He's one of the most consistent performers in wrestling today. I used to see him a lot at Ring of Honor shows during his early days. I'd see some of his best matches in attendance. I know that his match with Davey Richards at Death Before Dishonor 2010 in Toronto might be the best match I've seen live and in person, so it's great to see him achieve stardom and still be one of the top stars in WWE today. And two of my other favorites in WWE right now are Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. And of course, I'm heavily biased towards them because they hailed from Quebec. So I saw them at a lot of indie shows in Ottawa before they were famous. I saw them wrestle a lot at Ring of Honor shows live many years ago. I actually met Sami Zayn, I think, in 2011, while he was still doing the gimmick of the masked Mexican luchador, El Generico, and he stayed in character the whole time because whenever he spoke to me, he only spoke with a fake Spanish accent and only said a few broken words of English and mostly answered questions, said words like hola and si, so he was really committed to that gimmick. Sami Zayn is one of the top acts in wrestling right now. I think they've really caught something special with him. And I've actually got tickets to see him to go to the Elimination Chamber pay-per-view in Montreal in February next month, or 2 months from now. And I think they've got something big planned for Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn because they are both Quebec boys. And I know that the Montreal fans are really going to be cheering them on crazy. So I'm really going to be looking forward to that. Our next question is from Rupert. What was the last film that you watched? Would you recommend it? Well, as you all know, I'm a hardcore movie fan. I have seen thousands of movies throughout my life, and I've probably mentioned this on past podcast episodes, but I think that my all-time favorite movie is Die Hard. So, not surprisingly, the last film that I saw in the cinema was Violent Night, and I can't tell you how much I was looking forward to that because it was a very unique variation on the Die Hard formula. In case you haven't heard of it, it has the whole Die Hard scenario about someone being trapped inside a building on Christmas while a bunch of terrorists come by and take hostages and try to commit a robbery. But the big difference here is that the person in the John McClane role is none other than Santa Claus himself, played by David Harbour, and he's phenomenal in it, and I love the fact that the Santa in this has become very drunk and surly and is about to quit, and is very disillusioned because the world seemed to have lost its Christmas spirit, and we've seen that formula a lot in a lot of Christmas movies, but the key difference here is that Santa regains his Christmas spirit by killing terrorists, which is such a cool play on the Die Hard formula. And there's some great homages to Die Hard, and also an amazing homage to Home Alone, where one of the hero's daughters has to stop these terrorists from catching her, and she sets up these really gory booby traps that make Home Alone's booby traps look like kids' play. And here's an interesting piece of trivia. I recently rewatched Die Hard 2, Die Harder, which also takes place at Christmas, and I'd completely forgotten that John Leguizamo, who plays the main villain in Violent Night, actually played a terrorist in Die Hard 2, but he only has about 2 lines, and I think both of his lines are dubbed over by a different voice, so you can watch the entire movie and completely miss him, or not even realize he's in it. So I think it's kind of cool that 32 years later, he has done another Die Hard type of action film, and graduated up to the position of lead terrorist, which is pretty impressive. But yeah, as a huge fan of Die Hard, I loved Violent Night, and I think I would rank it now as one of my all-time favorite Christmas movies, and it'll probably be a tradition for me to watch it every year during the holiday season. So our next question from Rupert about movies again is, are you a fan of horror movies? Who's your favorite horror antagonist? Well, I am most definitely a fan of horror movies and watch every horror film that I can and could talk about that topic for hours, but I won't because I don't want this episode to be 7 hours long. As far as my favorite horror antagonist goes, I'm a big fan of the classics. I grew up, the films that got me interested into horror were the original Halloween and the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So, of course, I was a huge fan of Michael Myers and Leatherface, though they have done those franchises and rebooted them so many times and changed the backstories of these characters that they've become kind of convoluted. But I like the idea of like Michael and Leatherface just being these killing machines who never speak, and that's pretty much all that completely drives them. But I might say that my candidate for my all-time favorite horror movie antagonist, it's kind of a loose definition here because this movie is more of a thriller than a horror film, but it's as scary as hell, and that's the 1988 version of The Vanishing, which was originally made in the Netherlands and France. And the main antagonist in that is a man named Raymond Lemorne, who is played by French actor Bernard Pierre Donadieu, and I consider him to be one of the most terrifying villains in film history, because he pretty much plays someone who seems like an ordinary family man. He's got a good job, he's got a wife and 2 daughters, and he suddenly decides to pull off this horrible abduction and murder for no reason other than the fact that he wants to see if he's capable of true evil and would be able to pull it off. And that's his entire motivation. And that's why I love this film. I think it's a complete masterpiece, has one of the most terrifying endings of all time. And also the fact that I would not recommend this film to people who have had a loved one go missing, because I think it does a very effective job in going into the mindset of someone who loses a relative or a loved one who goes missing and would do anything to find out the truth about what happened to them, even if it could potentially cost them their own life. So I would not recommend this film if you have lost a loved one, because it's every missing person's family's worst nightmare. They did do an American Hollywood remake of The Vanishing in 1993, which starred Jeff Bridges and Kiefer Sutherland, but I think that movie is a complete travesty. Don't get me started on it. If you have to see this film, I highly recommend going back and watching the original 1988 version, because it's one of my all-time favorite movies, and Raymond Lemorne is one of my all-time favorite movie antagonists. So our next question is from Keith. A number of high-profile unsolved mysteries cases were solved in the last few years that were originally speculated to have been committed by serial killers, such as Lisa Zeigert, Jay Cook and Tanya von Keilenborg, Annette Schnee and Bobby Joe Oberholzer, but in reality, the murderers were men who apparently had never killed before. Do you think this would change our understanding of offenders who commit these types of crimes? Well, I think this question is the perfect segue from talking about Raymond Lemorne from The Vanishing, a character who seems to be an ordinary man, but then just decides to commit murder because he, for the hell of it, without any real motive. And that seems to be the case with a lot of these cases that are being solved by a genetic genealogy within the past few years, where DNA winds up linking the crime to people who were never on the radar as suspects to begin with. And when you look into the backgrounds of these people, they don't have any other known murders. So it just seems like they decided to commit this one crime several decades ago and then go on living the rest of their lives as an ordinary person without harming anyone else. That particularly rings true for the murders of Annette Schnee and Bobby Joe Oberholzer, which is more commonly known as the Orange Sock murders, because that involved a perpetrator picking up the 2 victims who did not even know each other while hitchhiking at separate times and then murdering them at separate locations on the same night. So you figure that anyone brazen enough to do that must have other victims or must be a full-fledged serial killer. But thus far, the guy who was charged and convicted of these murders, Alan Lee Phillips, they've never been able to link him to any other crimes. So for all we know, he committed these 2 murders that one night and then never killed anyone else again. And we've seen this also with the Delphi murders. They recently arrested a suspect named Richard Allen, who had never even been heard of until his name was announced as part of his arrest. And he technically has not been found guilty in a court of law, so we can't say with 100% certainty if he's the murderer. But as far as anyone can tell, Richard Allen has no other crimes, no history of violence in his background, so people who knew him probably thought he was an unlikely candidate to just murder 2 girls like this. So yeah, I think these cases do change our perception that not all of these murders are killed by serial killers, and that I think there are just a lot of people out there who suddenly decide, I'm going to commit murder, I want to see if I can get away with it, and I may not do it ever again, but I need to do it at least once. And a lot of the times they do it and would manage to get away with it if it wasn't for DNA or genetic genealogy. So our next question is from John. Most interesting cold case development / update in the past 5 years. Well, we've seen a lot of high-profile crimes get solved, but I still think that the number one game changer was the arrest and identification of the Golden State Killer, which took place in April of 2018. As you well know, the Golden State Killer was responsible for about a dozen murders and over 50 sexual assaults over the course of several years. He was one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. And since he just stopped, there was a lot of assumption that he must be dead by now, or maybe he's been incarcerated for another crime. But then DNA and genetic genealogy linked all these crimes to a man named Joseph James DeAngelo, and he was subsequently arrested, charged with all these crimes, and sent to prison. And everyone was surprised to find out that he was still alive after all these years and had just gotten to the point where he decided to stop killing and go on living a normal life again. And of course, like I said, if the Golden State Killer had not been caught by genetic genealogy, I think most of these other crimes that have been solved these past 5 years would not have been solved, because this pretty much changed the game for cold case investigations, and everyone realized, hey, we can use DNA samples and genetic genealogy to link this crime to individuals, and more often than not, they wound up finding suspects who had never popped up on the radar before, and it led to them being arrested and convicted after so many years. And it's such a satisfying feeling, because I'm sure many of these men or these perpetrators thought they had gotten away with it. And I'm sure within the last few years, a lot of people who committed crimes several decades ago are probably sweating, thinking that it's only a matter of time before the evidence is linked to my DNA and someone is going to show up at the door and arrest me. And like I just said, if it wasn't for the Golden State Killer being caught, I don't think we would have all these other cases that have been solved these past several years. So our next question is from Jennifer. What case are you most surprised was solved in 2022? Well, I'm going to talk about this more extensively on our update episode, which comes out next week. But the resolution that shocked me the most was the Robert Hoagland case, which I covered on episode number 149 of The Trail Went Cold. Robert Hoagland vanished from his home in Newtown, Connecticut in July of 2013. It was one of those cases where I couldn't find a theory that made 100% complete sense, because there was some evidence pointing to a voluntary disappearance, some evidence pointing to a suicide, some evidence pointing towards potential foul play, but nothing made sense. So it came as a complete shock to me in early December when they found out that Robert Hoagland had disappeared voluntarily and started a new life under a new identity in a small town in New York State, located about 90 miles away from Newtown, Connecticut, and that he had recently died of natural causes. And they were able to discover that he had been living under the fake name Richard King, but they found out that he was actually Robert Hoagland, and this case was conclusively solved. And needless to say, the vast majority of missing persons cases that I cover on The Trail Went Cold, a voluntary disappearance is the least likely scenario, because it's really hard to disappear and stay under the radar for so many years. I mean, it would be a lot easier to get away with it if they went missing during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But I never thought that someone who went missing in 2013, which is the digital age, would be able to pull this off, where they're able to start a new life under a new identity and work a new job in a different location for 9 years before they were found out. So needless to say, that update took me by complete surprise. More and more details are coming in about how exactly Robert Hoagland did this, but because he is now deceased, I don't think we'll ever learn the full truth about what happened or why he did this. So needless to say, this was probably the most shocking update I've ever covered on The Trail Went Cold. So our next question from Rupert: what cases do you think are likely to be solved in 2023? Well, it's funny, on my previous Q&A episodes that I released in 2018 and 2020, I was asked this exact same question, and in both cases, the answers I gave turned out to be true, so I'm hoping that lightning will strike 3 times again. In 2018, I predicted that the unidentified murder victim, who was known only as Orange Socks, would eventually be identified because her case had been taken on by the DNA Doe Project, and they have done a lot of great work identifying John and Jane Does. And sure enough, later that year, she was positively identified as a woman named Deborah Jackson. In 2020, my pick was the Sumter County Does, because I know they were being looked at by the DNA Doe Project, and they had such a great success rate that I figured it was only a question of time until these 2 victims were identified. And it literally happened only a few weeks after my Q&A episode came out, when the Sumter County Does were identified as James Freund and Pamela Buckley. So a lot of the unidentified decedents featured on The Trail Went Cold have gotten their names back, but there are a couple that are still unidentified, so they're going to be my picks for 2023. There's Little Miss Panisofsky, the murder victim who was found in Florida in 1971. I don't know if her case is being worked on by the DNA Doe Project or Othram or any of these other organizations, but I think that if they take on the case, they will eventually find out her identity through DNA profiling and genetic genealogy. And I'll also pick William L. Toomey, the unidentified man who walked into a church in Idaho 40 years ago and decided to take his own life by swallowing a cyanide capsule. Unfortunately, from what I've heard, this is not an active investigation, so no one has ever given the order for his body to be exhumed to obtain DNA samples. But I think if they do decide to do that, they'll be able to use forensic genealogy to figure out who he really is. So fingers crossed on that one. So my next question from Julio, my question to you is, which missing persons case where two or more people went missing simultaneously get solved in the near future or has the best evidence to being solved? A few examples are the Las Cruces Bowling Massacre, Yogurt Shop Murders, Springfield 3, Beaumont Children, etc. Well, this is an interesting question because I remember that two of the most memorable cases which got featured on the TV show Disappeared were the disappearances of the McStay family and the disappearances of the Jameson family, which completely baffled me because how does an entire family go missing simultaneously? And wouldn't you know it, the remains of both these families were actually found within 1 week of each other in November of 2013, which I felt was pretty remarkable. And in the McStay case, they actually charged and convicted a suspect of their murder, so that case is completely solved. But the Jameson family, we still don't know their exact cause of death, so it's still a cold case. Well, another example of this where my fingers crossed that it will be solved in the near future is the disappearance of the Millbrook twins, Jeanette and Danette Millbrook, who both went missing in Georgia in March of 1990. As you well know, I covered that way back on episode number 12 of The Trail Went Cold, and it's so unusual because you're not going to find too many cases where twins go missing simultaneously, but the case got no attention from the media and was ignored by the police for several years, but now it's been featured on so many other podcasts, particularly The Fault Line, that they even did a TV series about this on Oxygen, a TV special, so it's gotten more coverage these past few years than it had ever gotten since 1990, and I do think because they are uncovering all these new leads that there is a good chance that they will solve this sometime in the near future. And I've certainly got my fingers crossed for that because I do think that there's just so many people out there who care so much about finding a resolution in this case that I think it's only a matter of time before they find the twins' remains and figure out what happened to them. So our next question is from Kathy. What is the status of DNA testing in the JonBenet Ramsey and Amy Mihalik cases? Well, I haven't covered either of these cases on The Trail Went Cold, but they have been in the news a lot these past few years. I know that in October of 2021, they discovered Amy Mihalik's DNA on some items that were tested, and I know that they found another person of interest and obtained that person's DNA. So it sounded like they were on the verge of potentially solving this case, but I haven't heard anything within the past year, but I can't really provide much details about a status update. I know it's difficult because I know Amy was a missing person for a while before her remains were found after more than 3 months, but I'm guessing that whatever the status is of the DNA right now, they just do not have the necessary evidence to arrest someone and secure a conviction in a court beyond a reasonable doubt. The JonBenet Ramsey DNA testing is more interesting because I actually attended a session at CrimeCon in Las Vegas this past year, 2 separate sessions in fact, with JonBenet's father, John Ramsey, where he announced that him and his supporters were hoping to get more advanced DNA testing done on some of the evidence to try to find JonBenet's killer. And I know there's been a lot of controversy because the evidence is currently in the possession of the Boulder Police Department, and they want it taken from them and given to outside sources in order to perform their own testing, but the Boulder Police Department is refusing to release it. As far as I know, the whole thing is still in a standstill, and it's always very frustrating to me when a lot of authority figures refuse to get the necessary DNA testing performed, which might lead to conclusive answers to help solve the case. Personally, I've always been someone who believes that an intruder was likely responsible for JonBenét's murder. I do not think the family is involved, though I could change my mind at any point if some of the results show differently. But the fact that JonBenét's father is attempting to get the evidence tested shows that they do seem to be serious about solving this case, and if an intruder's DNA is found on some of the evidence, then maybe it will finally lead back to a suspect and solve this case after all these years. So our next question is from John. What are your theories as to what happened to Vasily Gorgos? I had honestly never heard of this case before you put it in my direction, but I did a Google search, and now I'm down a major rabbit hole because this is very weird. The story goes is that Vasily Gorgos was a 63-year-old farmer from Romania who suddenly left his family to go on a business trip in 1991 and then never returned. But apparently, last year, sometime in August of 2021, Vasily Gorgos showed back at his family's home, now 93 years old, and suddenly made a surprise return. And the story goes that he was still dressed in the same clothes he was wearing when he went missing back in 1991, and is now telling people that he has no memory of where he's been these past 30 years. So I don't know what to make about this one. I do know that because it's from a non-English speaking country, that maybe certain details have been mistranslated or exaggerated, but who knows? I definitely want to delve into this because as we've seen from the Robert Hoagland case, which I just talked about, people still disappear voluntarily and then are found years later. So maybe the same thing happened to Vasily Gorgos. I have no idea what to make of this, but this is going to be my next rabbit hole, and if all goes well, maybe I'll cover this on a future episode of The Trail Went Cold. Our next question is from Charlie. Is there any plans to release any of the Trail Went Cold episodes on YouTube? I get this question asked a lot, but not really in the near future. I know that McGill and I have discussed it, but there really isn't much of an upside to it because, as you well know, YouTube can kind of be a major pain when it comes to pulling up content that either gets pulled or demonetized because of their unpredictable algorithms. I know there are some podcasts who have released their episodes on YouTube, and I'm sure it could help pick up like a bigger audience. But a lot of the time for us to get sponsors and stuff, we have to rely on downloads that are made from the podcasting platform. And if people are watching our episodes on YouTube, then we're not getting the downloads. So it does not seem like there is too much upside to releasing our episodes on YouTube. So we really don't have any plans to do so in the near future. And our next question is from Trish. I heard one episode where you talked to a reporter. Is it too hard to bring in outside interviews for you? Well, the reason we don't do interviews on our podcast is because, well, I'm a writer. I'm not an interviewer. I'm just much more comfortable writing out a narrative for me to recite and a script rather than conduct an interview because I can sometimes come across as very awkward when trying to generate a conversation with someone that I've never really met. We did do a few interviews. I know that we worked with another podcast called Suspect Convictions, and we released a few episodes where I interviewed Scott Reeder, a journalist from Illinois, about the cases he was covering on the podcast. But even though you would not know from the final product, we did run into some technical issues while trying to record those episodes, which almost made me swear off from doing interviews on future podcasts because it causes a lot of stress for me. I mean, there are other podcasts where people do conduct interviews, and they're usually great, but people like to listen to The Trail Went Cold because we are a non-interview podcast. We are more of a narrative podcast in which you can learn the details of the story. And if you want to listen to interviews, there are so many other podcasts out there that might be more to your liking. But I'm quite comfortable with The Trail Went Cold and the format that we have right now. So our next question is from Rupert. What's your favorite episode or segment from Unsolved Mysteries? Which is pretty much like asking me to choose between what is my favorite child. But I've always said that the one segment on Unsolved Mysteries which really stands out and it got me so interested in the show is the unexplained death of Aileen Conway, where she died in a car crash, but none of the theories surrounding what happened to her make 100% complete sense. And it had such an impact on me that was the reason I decided to make it the topic of our very first episode of The Trail Went Cold. And appropriately enough, the episode where it's featured on Unsolved Mysteries still ranks as one of my all-time favorite episodes of the show. It's a pretty special one because it's the very first episode hosted by Robert Stack, so it'll be the very first one you find on the official Unsolved Mysteries channels. And just look at the lineup. I mean, it starts out with the murder of Shannon Moore by her estranged husband, Dave Davis. It moves on to the Aileen Conway case, and then it goes to an historical mystery about the Glenn and Bessie Hyde disappearance while they were rafting in the Grand Canyon. And then it concludes with the segment about the disappearance of Dottie Kaler, featuring the infamous interview with her husband, Jewel Kaler. It's pretty much all you could ask for in an Unsolved Mysteries episode, so it still ranks pretty much as my favorite, though another personal favorite of mine is their 90-minute special about the Alcatraz escape that they aired later on in Season 1, which is why I decided to cover it on The Trail Went Cold earlier this year. So our next question is from Maggie. How do you watch Unsolved Mysteries nowadays? To clarify, do you ever rewatch the show aimlessly, i.e. put on a random episode with no specific case you want to see in mind? Or do you only watch specific segments when you're searching a case you plan to cover? If you do the latter, how have you compiled your list of Unsolved Mysteries cases? And when discussing segments that aren't available on Amazon Prime or FilmRise, are you able to draw from memory? Well, it's true that whenever I cover an Unsolved Mysteries case on The Trail Went Cold, I will go back and watch the original Unsolved Mysteries segment. But I still watch it for fun quite a bit, where I'll just randomly put on random episodes. Sometimes I will just pick them at random, where I'll say, I feel like watching this particular episode about these cases, or I feel like watching a particular season, and we'll watch a couple of them in a row, which aired in like 1989 or 1990 or something. And as you probably know, I often hold Unsolved Mysteries live watches with my listeners, where on a Saturday night, maybe once a month or once every 2 months, we'll just get together in a screening room and I'll screen about 3 hours worth of segments from the show, just randomly pick them, and we can watch them and discuss them in the comments section with my fellow listeners. Those are always a lot of fun, and where I get to revisit the show. In regards to deciding which Unsolved Mysteries cases to cover on The Trail Went Cold, I really don't have a set pattern. I mean, obviously, I started off by covering the Aileen Conway case because it's probably my all-time favorite segment, but you'll notice that the second Unsolved Mysteries case I covered on this podcast was the murder of David Cox, and that was one which is not considered to be one of the more famous Unsolved Mysteries cases, but I had my own theories on it, my own thoughts, and I know that it didn't receive a lot of discussion, so that's why I decided to cover it on episode number 3. And a lot of the time, I'll just kind of decide at random when I want to cover them. There may be a big case where it's like, I really want to cover it, but there's so much material I want to wait until the right time, which is why it took me several years before I finally did episodes on stuff like The Boys on the Tracks and Alcatraz and Danny Casolaro. And yes, I do some podcast episodes on Unsolved Mysteries cases that you cannot currently find on their official FilmRise channel or on YouTube. But rest assured, I still have my own copies of them that I can access at my leisure if I want to do research, so I don't have to draw them from memory. Even before Unsolved Mysteries was uploaded onto an official FilmRise channel, I had some compilation DVDs that had pretty much all the classic segments, so I can access them at any time. But amusingly enough, a lot of these old segments were kind of like 4th generation VHS quality that were taped from TV, so it is pretty cool to be able to watch them on FilmRise and get digitally remastered clear versions after watching bad copies of them that had very low audio and tracking problems from the VHS for so many years. It's so great to get these clear quality versions. So our next question is from Marina. If you had the chance to travel back in time to meet Mr. Robert Stack, what would you first tell him or ask him? Well, that's a very good question, and I think that if I was able to meet Robert Stack and I was able to ask him some questions, I would pick his brain to get his personal thoughts on a lot of the cases that he covered on Unsolved Mysteries. I mean, that's the thing, is that when he was hosting the show, I'm sure he was not able to go to the media and give his own personal thoughts on any of the cases he covered to avoid any possible conflict of interest, so we really never know what he thought about a lot of these stories. I mean, the one thing we do know is that he was a natural skeptic about a lot of the UFO and ghosts and paranormal segments, and that there were at least a couple of them where he would be narrating them and just turn to the producer and say, "Oh, come on," because he felt they were so ridiculous, and that he generally preferred to do like lost loves cases or true crime cases because those were his opportunity to genuinely genuinely help people by getting all these unsolved cases national coverage on television. But if I ever met Robert Stack, I would really like to know his personal theories about a lot of these cases that he narrated, because as the host of the show, I've always wondered, was he privy to information about these cases which was never released publicly? Did he ever have his own personal thoughts? I mean, did he cover, say, a suspicious suicide case where he personally believed that the victim's death was a suicide, but he still felt obligated to narrate it because he hosted the show? Did he ever do a final appeal case where he thought the appellant they were profiling was guilty all along, but he still narrated the segment anyway? And I would love to hear, what was his personal thoughts about what happened to Aileen Conway and a lot of these other baffling cases that are still unsolved to this day. So if I ever meet Robert Stack in the afterlife, you can bet that I'm going to talk his ear off and ask him about so many of these cases. So our next question from Darren: if you were given the opportunity to do whatever you want for one new episode of Unsolved Mysteries, what would you choose to do with that 1 hour segment? Well, as you all know, Unsolved Mysteries is on Netflix right now, the new reboot, and most of their episodes are generally between 45 minutes to 1 hour long, and only generally cover one case per episode. And there's been a lot of criticism over the fact that they love to cover a lot of suspicious suicide cases or accidental death cases where there's a good possibility that the victim's death was a suicide or an accident all along, and there's no real mystery to solve. And a lot of people have said that they kind of wish that they could perform more actual murders or actual missing persons cases where there really is something to solve. I really would love to see Unsolved Mysteries tackle some cases where they've gotten a lot of exposure on podcasts, but they've never really been featured on any TV series. And one case that comes to mind is the Fort Worth 3 case, or the Fort Worth Missing Trio case, which I covered on episode number 2 of The Trail Went Cold. As you well know, it involves 3 young girls, 17-year-old Mary Rachel Trelisha, 14-year-old Lisa Renee Wilson, and 9-year-old Julianne Mosley, who went missing after supposedly visiting a local shopping center in Fort Worth, Texas to go Christmas shopping on December the 23rd, 1974. And I had read about this case online. I was surprised it wasn't more well known, which is why I decided to tackle it on episode number 2 of The Trail Went Cold. And it's since been covered on a lot of podcasts. I do know that the Gone Cold podcast, situated out of Texas, recently did an excellent 8-part series on this where they debunked some of the misinformation and misconceptions about this case. And as far as I know, it's never been featured on a TV series, so I would love to see the Fort Worth 3 or Fort Worth Missing Trio case get featured on a 1 hour episode of Unsolved Mysteries, because I think that could give the case the national exposure it needed, which might lead to a resolution after all these years. So our next question is from Ryan. You've indicated before that you prefer not to profile cases involving wanted fugitives since there is no real mystery behind it. Understandable. With that said, could you give your opinion on a few Unsolved Mysteries wanted fugitives and what you think happened to them? Yes, I've only done a handful of wanted fugitive cases on The Trail Went Cold because, like Ryan just said, a lot of them, we know who did it, we know what the crime was. The only question is, where is the missing fugitive and how can they be recaptured? So there really isn't a lot of mystery to analyze. Of course, I've covered some of them. One of the most prominent is the William Bradford Bishop case, because he's been missing since 1976 for the murders of his entire family and has still not been found, and there's a lot to analyze in that case. And I'm also fascinated by cases in which a person is missing and there's still ambiguity about whether or not they are the killer, or they might have been another victim and their body has just not been found. And examples of this include the Mike Reamer case and the Dub and Chance Walker-Hagen case, and also the Adam Emery case, which I've covered on as a Patreon bonus episode, because there's a lot of ambiguity about whether he is still a wanted fugitive or if he actually killed himself by jumping off a bridge before he could go to prison. So Ryan provided me with 5 examples of wanted fugitives from Unsolved Mysteries and asked me to provide my thoughts, so I'll do that right here. One case is Richard Bear, who has been a wanted fugitive since 1985 for a murder that took place in North Carolina, where he threw a young woman named Sherry Hart, literally threw her off a cliff. He was arrested and was in jail awaiting trial before he finally broke free, and he has not been recaptured for the past nearly 38 years now. There have been some solid leads over the years for Bear, but they've just been unable to find him. And it's pretty amazing that he's been able to elude detection for this long. He technically could still be alive after all this time, but when a lot of these fugitives who don't have a lot of resources at this disposal manage to stay under the radar without being captured, it makes me wonder if they might have died while living under a false identity or died in the wilderness somewhere and have just never been found. And until I hear otherwise, I will assume that Richard Bear is still alive, but would not surprise me if he's already dead by this point. The next wanted fugitive is Sharon Kinney, and that is a wild story that I think I could cover on The Trail Went Cold at some point because there's so much to talk about. Sharon Kinney was a woman from Missouri who was charged and convicted of a number of murders of different victims and was traveled to Mexico while awaiting trial for one of them and committed another murder again and was put in a Mexican prison. But during a blackout in December of 1969, Sharon was able to escape, and she has not been seen in over 50 years, but she still has the currently oldest outstanding arrest warrant for murder in the history of Missouri, and so they are still looking for her, even though she would be 83 years old if she is still alive. I have a feeling that Sharon Kinney is dead, that she might have been killed or died of natural causes in Mexico somewhere and never made it back into the United States, because I am surprised that she would manage to remain under the radar for this long. But it is good to know that there's still a warrant on her, so if she is still alive, she could still be brought back and tried for murder. Our next wanted fugitive is William Fisher, and wow, what a scumbag this guy was, and I'm surprised this case doesn't get talked about a lot more. But William Fisher was a guy who abandoned his wife and children, but in New York in 1987, his son Billy came back to him because he was suffering from cystic fibrosis and wanted to know if his father would lend him money for medical treatment. And when Billy went to visit him, he also brought along his new girlfriend, Nancy Heyer, and tragically, William wound up murdering them both and fled the state, and he has not been seen in 35 years. I have a hard time believing that William Fisher is still alive because he was known for being a major cocaine addict at that point. So I can't imagine that someone like him who was in his late 40s and lived a high-risk lifestyle would still be alive 35 years later. So I think he probably died somewhere and is still a John Doe, and they've just never been able to positively identify him. Our next wanted fugitive is Richard Bockledge, who has been wanted since 1980. He was a pharmacy student who was being kicked out of college and then went on a rampage and murdered his estranged fiancée, Tanya Kopik, in Kansas City, Missouri. After an arrest warrant was issued for his arrest, his abandoned car was found in a remote area of Manitoba, but there have been no confirmed sightings of him ever since. I'm inclined to think because he didn't have a lot of resources at his disposal to stay under the radar that he is probably dead, and I think there's a good chance that he might have walked into a wooded area near the spot where he abandoned his car and took his own life, and they've just been able to find his remains in spite of extensive searches because skeletal remains are easy to miss in a wilderness area. So yeah, but I do hope that they can conclusively find him because it would be nice to know if he's still alive or dead. And the last wanted fugitive is Hazel Head, who has been wanted since late 1998. She was a drifter/con artist who went around the country under a number of different aliases. She would hook herself up with other men and then use them to drain their bank account and then just move on to the next victim. And the reason she was wanted is because she hooked up with an older man named Charles Barker, but she wound up murdering him and draining his bank account and has not been seen since. Because she is a professional who knows how to change her identity, I think there is a good chance that Hazel Head is still alive somewhere and is probably living under a new identity. But on the other hand, if she did change her identity and then died of, say, natural causes or something, then it may take a long time to put two and two together and figure out who she is. So it's possible she could be in a grave somewhere, a pauper's grave, or maybe under a grave under a false name. But regardless, it would be nice if she was actually found. So our next question is from Ben. You've mentioned before that you've traveled extensively in the United States. If you were to move to the US of A, is there a city, state, or region you've most connected with and would enjoy living? Or is there another place you've been to either worldwide or even Canada where you would really enjoy getting the chance to live? Well, I have traveled a lot because I was lucky enough to have a father who was a professional airline pilot, so he took us on a lot of trips when I was younger. And one place that I enjoy visiting is Arizona because my parents have bought a condo down there to visit during the winter. So I try to go to it whenever I can. And in fact, at the time this episode is released, I am currently in Arizona celebrating the holidays with my family, which marks the first time I have ever spent Christmas outside of Canada in a sunny climate. But all that being said, I don't know if I would want to live here full time because I always visit here in the winter, and I hear that it's brutally hot to be in Arizona during the summer, so I'm not sure I'd want to live here during that time period. And I'm so used to growing up with snow in Canada that even if I moved to a warmer climate in like a southern state, I probably would miss snow. So that's why I still am kind of attached to living in Canada, where I can have maybe 6 months of nice weather and spring and fall and summer and a couple months of snow in the winter. I think it's a nice balance because that's how I've grown up most of my life. I visited some really nice places like New Orleans. I really love New Orleans. I went to Italy one time and really enjoyed being there. But it always gets to the point where even if you're there for long periods of time, you do get homesick and you want to go back to Canada. So I don't know if there's anywhere else in the world I would like to live full time. I just love living in Ontario and living in Ottawa, that I pretty much love making Canada my permanent home. And an interesting question here from Sandra from South Africa. My question is, after researching and recording the contents of each episode, how do you keep the darkness from encroaching on your demeanor? An interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer it, but yeah, it is an interesting topic to explore because if you do a true crime podcast for nearly 7 consecutive years and research hundreds of cases, you're going to see some pretty depressing subject matter, and you have to keep yourself in a good mindset in order to continue to do this week in and week out without becoming too overwhelmed by all the darkness. I know a lot of other podcasters where it becomes so overwhelming that they decide that they have to take breaks because having to examine all what is pretty much the worst day of so many people's lives can be pretty exhausting and emotionally overwhelming after a while. It's hard to adequately explain how you prevent the darkness from overwhelming you, but I think the most important thing is to always engage in empathy and remember that these are real people and that even though they are pretty depressing stories, you need to convince yourself that you are doing some good by getting these out into the world because technically these are all unsolved cold cases and any attention they receive can only be good and increase the chances of them being solved. And you just and you also say to yourself, even if these cases aren't solved, you at least want these victims to be remembered for who they really were and ensure they are not forgotten, even if they went missing or were murdered. And of course, it also helps that I don't spend all my time like embroiled in true crime. Like I do have a lot of hobbies. I watch a lot of movies. I love baseball. I love hockey. I love professional wrestling. And it's like I pretty much decided to myself, don't focus all your time on cold cases and unsolved mysteries and crime. If it's feeling too overwhelming, then go off and watch a light movie or go watch a funny show or something. And that's how I always find that balance in my life so that doing true crime for all these years has not overwhelmed me. So our last question is from Cameron, and it's a very important question about a very important topic, and it's, my question for you as a podcaster, do you ever feel conflicted in how to present your podcast as an informative production in regards to missing persons, unsolved murders, etc.? The reason I ask is because I remember one user on Reddit responding to a topic regarding true crime, and as a former victim of a crime that was later profiled on a podcast, they conveyed the notion that they get really annoyed when they hear someone gush about needing their true crime fix when they work out, drive long distances, or do some other daily mundane tasks that occupies time. The person claimed that their trauma shouldn't be someone else's entertainment fodder. Do you ever worry with your production that consumers might take your efforts to try and help people the wrong way and not have an arm's length perspective with the content you provide to the public? Well, this is a topic that has been discussed a lot these past few years, and it's the whole subject of ethics in true crime. And I think one reason it has come about is because a lot of people who have been the victims of true crime or had loved ones who were victims who either were murdered or went missing are starting to become true crime podcasters themselves and offer a very important perspective. One of the trendsetters for this is Sarah Turney, of course, whose sister Alyssa went missing, and she has been pushing for years because she believed her father was responsible for Alyssa's death, and she has since tried to spread the word about it on other podcasts, and has since become a podcast host herself, hosting the Voices for Justice podcast. When I attended the True Crime Podcast Festival in Dallas this past August, I attended a really important panel session where it involved 3 relatives of victims who were speaking about how the rise of true crime has affected them. This included Maura Murray's sister, Julie Murray, and of course, as you know, the disappearance of Maura Murray has become one of the most heavily discussed cold cases of the modern era, which has led to a lot of unsung drama and a lot of nasty things which have been said about Maura, which may not even be true. It also featured Eric Carter Landine, whose baby brother Jacob was murdered when Eric was still a child, and he has since started his own true crime podcast called True Consequences, and has always been very outspoken about the ethics of true crime. And it also featured Mariah Day, whose mother Betsy Faria was murdered by a friend of hers named Pam Hupp. And that case has heavily been covered on true crime shows, on podcasts, and this past year they even released a TV series called The Thing About Pam, which starred Renee Zellweger as Pam Hupp, but it faced a lot of criticism, particularly from the victim's family, because it was presented in the form of a dark comedy, and they said, "Do you not realize that this was a terrible tragedy for us, where a person we love was murdered, and you're treating it as entertainment?" So it was really interesting to see that panel session and see 3 people who have lost loved ones to true crime talk about how seeing the genre used as entertainment has become a very traumatic thing for them. And it is a touchy subject because even though true crime medium in podcasting could be a good thing that helps a lot of people, it still is technically used as entertainment for a lot of people and generates a lot of money for certain podcasters. And there's been a lot of question about the ethics of this. I mean, I definitely will not say that I'm perfect or the Trail Went Cold is perfect, but I always try to remember these lessons whenever I'm putting together an episode, to always be empathetic and also remember that these are real people, and do not try to say anything derogatory about any of these victims or their families, because this is a terrible tragedy for them. So I shouldn't just be presenting it as entertainment and use it as an opportunity to joke around and make dark humor surrounding this terrible tragedy. I mean, it is kind of different for me because The Trail Went Cold does exclusively cover unsolved cold cases where there are family members out there who are searching for answers. And most of the feedback that I have gotten from victims' families is positive, where they've told me that I am surprised that you're still talking about my loved one's case after all these years, but I do thank you for it, because even if the case isn't solved, I want to ensure that they're still remembered in a positive light. But I know that family members might think differently about podcasts that exclusively cover solved cold cases, because in their eyes, the case is done, it's closed, there's nothing left to solve, so they might not like their story being brought back into the spotlight on these podcasts and heard by so many other people. But that's not to say that those podcasters whose shows are exclusively based around cold cases should not release episodes. I mean, they should just always do it with as much empathy and respect that they can, and do not give off the impression that they're trying to exploit someone else's tragedy. So yeah, I know I will never be perfect, but I can only do the best I can, and I know that that being able to speak with victims' families and other podcasters who have had their lives directly affected by true crime has been a very valuable learning experience these past few years, and I try to remember all the lessons I learned whenever I put together a new episode, and just try to do the best job that I can to do justice to all these victims. And on that note, that about brings an end to this year's special Q&A episode, so a big thanks to everyone who sent in a question, and I hope I answered them to your satisfaction. I want to close things off by mentioning that 2022 was one of the best years I can remember when it came to solving cold cases, so next week, we're going to start off 2023 by releasing our 3rd special update episode, in which I'll discuss cases featured on The Trail Went Cold, which have either been solved this past year or had some major developments. There is definitely going to be a lot to talk about, so I hope you enjoy it. Anyway, I'd like to wish everyone here a Happy New Year, so be sure to join us again next Wednesday, which is technically next year, for our all-new update episode of The Trail Went Cold.